Mr. President, we have a debt ceiling for a reason. It's not completely arbitrary. It's not just made up. It's not something that someone came up with for their own amusement. No. When the sheer numeric volume, the quantity, the amount of our national debt ceases to cause panic, when the principle of jeopardizing our children's future loses effect, when the sacrifice it would cost taxpayers to pay the debt becomes laughably large, when all else fails, Congress sets a cap and says, here. We have to think about this. We have to think about this debt problem. There is a reason why we have that. There are sound reasons, rooted in logic, rooted in mathematics, rooted in the inevitability of our own future if we don't control the way that the federal government spends money. Now, nearly half of the members of this entire body, almost the entirety of the Senate Republican Conference, wrote a letter almost 2 months ago saying that we would not raise the debt limit. We committed that we were finally going to make a change for the sake of families back home and generations still unborn. We were going to make a change to rein in reckless spending. Now we're faced with more spending and more debt than our country has ever seen before. Our debt to GDP ratio has now reached a staggering level of 125%. The national debt is rushing towards $30 trillion, and far too quickly, this body is signaling a willingness, and I might dare say an eagerness, to sign on the dotted line without thinking through the consequences, or at least without thinking through the consequences of everyone outside this building, without thinking through the consequences of those who are wealthy and well-connected and will probably fare just fine, regardless of the federal government's reckless practice of effectively just printing more money. Let me tell you why that is such a problem, why I think it's so dangerous. First of all, as I mentioned a moment ago in my exchange with the senator from Kentucky, once we pass this 1-to-1 debt-to-GDP ratio, economists have scoured the landscape and looked at economies all over the world throughout human history, throughout periods of time in which any records have been kept at all. And they've concluded that this 100% debt-to-GDP ratio is tragic, it's dangerous, it's perilous. Once you cross that Rubicon, you're in some very, very tough positions. Economic growth starts to sputter. It staggers. It becomes more and more difficult to get out of the death spiral. You see, in the past, even as our national debt has been on the rise, we've been okay insofar as it has increased more or less to a degree commensurate with the size of our economy. Economic growth has been such that it's remained more or less constant, less constant lately, but it's remained somewhat proportional to the size of our economy. Economic growth has propelled that, but that's the problem. That's the goose that lays the golden egg. And we know what happens when you get rid of that goose, or when you meaningfully impair its ability to lay those golden eggs. Once we reach that point, we pass the 100% debt-to-GDP ratio, we know that our economic growth will stall, and it will become far more difficult to pay off what we've got. We also know that it matters on a very personal level, for reasons I'll get into more in just a moment, for poor and middle-class American families everywhere, throughout Utah and across America. People who are either living paycheck to paycheck or otherwise on a fixed income or a fixed budget, like most American families. They find that when the government just prints more money, as it tends to do when we start to borrow and then spend trillions of dollars at a time, more than the federal government is bringing in, that brings about inflation. It's as though there are a basket of goods that the economy is capable of faithfully, consistently producing from one year to another. Yeah, the basket of goods might grow or shrink a little bit from year to year, but it's going to tend to fluctuate mostly at the margins. The big picture is going to look fairly consistent. And so what happens if the government just prints more money and puts that into circulation? The purchasing power of each dollar is diminished. Now, this tends to work out fine. In fact, it can work out really well for wealthy and well-connected individuals. The rich usually figure out a way to get even richer off of this dynamic. They can hedge against it. They can figure out a way to benefit in one way or another from the chaos and sometimes even from the government spending. But where does that leave everyone else? Well, for most people, and by most people, I mean 99% of Americans, it's not going to make them wealthier. It's going to make them poorer, because most people are still living with more or less the same income, more or less the same resources. We've still got more or less the same basket of goods in the economy. But when you've got more dollars in the American economy, because we're effectively printing more, each dollar matters less. It buys less, everything from gas to groceries, from housing to health care. Poor and middle-class American families suffer, while the wealthy and well-connected might benefit, and a small handful of politicians receive a pat on the back, thanking them, congratulating them as they congratulate themselves and each other for what they characterize as a job well done. Sure, they'll always be able to point to someone who benefits from the programs that they're sponsoring, that they're creating. Some of those people won't be wealthy and well-connected interests. Some of them will be deserving families, some of them poor and middle-class American families. But you know, most families are just made poorer as government expands its footprint. Let's look at what happened last year alone. During the last few years before the pandemic, we were bringing in about $3 trillion a year in tax revenue. We were spending about $4 trillion. It's a massive, embarrassing, disgraceful, indefensible deficit, an annual deficit of about $1 trillion a year. Inexcusable, especially at the height, at the peak of an economic cycle. Then the pandemic hit. Last year, we still brought in about $3 trillion in tax revenue, just as we had expected, just as we had during the previous few years. Only this time we didn't spend $4 trillion. We spent $6.6 trillion. We brought in $3 trillion. We spent $6.6. We spent more than double what we brought in. We spent more money that was borrowed than more money that was paid into the Treasury. So what did that do? Well, it dramatically increased the money supply, abruptly, and in a way that hurts poor and middle-class American families. It's the predictable, foreseeable result. Look, if you're playing Monopoly and all of a sudden you decide to just double the amount of money that everyone gets in the game, it doesn't make everybody better off. It just increases the prices that are paid. What happens when that's real money, when those are real people? When it's not just plastic game pieces at stake, it's hungry mouths that need to be fed and sheltered and cared for. That's where it hurts. And that, Mr. President, is what's so tragic. When the government colludes with itself, with a small handful of people on the outside encouraging it to do so. Some whispering in the ears of politicians, telling them that they'll be doing so many great things. That the expenditures, that the expansion of government is worth the investment. They're not doing it with their own money, no. They're doing it with the money of America's poor and middle class. It's a really sort of reverse Robin Hood sort of thing. We're stealing from the poor to give to the rich and the well-connected, and to give good headlines to a small handful of politicians. Shame on us. Shame on us all. Shame on this institution, as we've done that. Look, I came to the United States Senate 11 years ago, committed to reducing the size, the scope, the reach, the cost, the overall footprint of the federal government, its impact on the lives of everyday citizens. I did so based on the understanding, based on the indisputable fact that whenever government expands its reach, it does so at the expense of individual liberty and individual prosperity. It doesn't mean that government doesn't have a place, doesn't mean that we don't need government. Quite to the contrary, we do. It just means that there's always a balancing that has to be taken into account. You can't expand government without hurting average, everyday people who are subject to those things. And unfortunately, 11 years later, that same government is larger, more expensive, and more burdensome than ever before. In a farcically feudal system, Americans now work for months out of every year just to pay their federal taxes. And then after all that is done, they're insultingly demeaned and told it's not enough. In fact, it hasn't been enough for a long time. Even though some of you who are now taxpayers and now voters have now worked months, at least weeks, maybe months, out of every year just to pay your federal taxes. And even though a lot of this debt may have been accumulated before some of you were old enough to vote, or some of you were even born, no matter, you've got to pay it. This is making that worse. We're making it worse for present living Americans, those who are of voting age, working age, tax-paying age, and those who are not. It's also adding to the burdens that will be faced by those who haven't even yet been born, whose parents have yet to meet. The regulatory state is growing ever more costly in terms of its economic impact. I've been studying the cost of the federal regulatory system for about 25 years. I first started thinking about it while I was in law school. I remember a guest speaker came to speak at our law school, and he explained that the federal regulatory system adds what he characterized as sort of a backdoor, invisible, de facto tax on poor and middle-class Americans. He explained that it's a backdoor, invisible tax, and that it's regressive in that it affects everyone, and disproportionately the poor and middle class, because of the fact that nowhere is any consumer able to identify the precise cost to them. In fact, most of them don't even know that it exists, because unlike their tax bill, there's no return at the end of the year. Unlike their sales tax, it typically will show up on someone's receipt, or a property tax, or anything else. There's no written indication of it that tells any one taxpayer or citizen what it's costing them every year, but it's there. Anyway, so back in, I think it was 1996 or 1997, he explained that the federal regulatory system was imposing this backdoor, invisible, highly regressive tax on Americans to the tune of $300 or $400 billion a year. And I remember thinking this is staggering, because that's a lot of money. It's a lot of money that could otherwise go toward other priorities, whether in the government, shoring up Social Security or Medicare or some other program, providing our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines with what they need, or in the lives of families, providing for the housing, the education, or the nourishment or other needs of our children. It just goes into the cost of complying with federal regulations. So yeah, Americans do pay for that, he explained. They just pay for it in a way that they can't quite see. There's no single bill that tallies the size of the expense for it, but they do pay for it nonetheless. They pay for it with higher prices on goods and services, everything they buy, and they also pay for it with diminished wages, unemployment, and underemployment. So here we are 25 years later. No one knows for sure what the federal regulatory system costs, but most estimates I've seen of late put the number at about $2 trillion a year. $2 trillion, that's the backdoor invisible tax that Americans pay through higher prices on goods and services, diminished wages, unemployment, and underemployment, due to what it costs to comply with federal regulations. Most people don't even think much about federal regulations, and with good reason. People have other better things to do. Those who do think about them are perhaps inclined to think, maybe because they've been taught to think, or because they've never been taught otherwise, that these costs are borne by billionaires, that they're borne by big blue chip corporations, or that a type of industrial tycoon that you would associate with a monopoly game piece, perhaps. But they are, in fact, borne by poor and middle-class Americans everywhere. That's money they can't get back, on top of the money that they had to pay after working weeks or months out of every year just to pay their federal taxes. And then being told, by the way, after the $2 trillion that you as a people were required to pay through this backdoor, invisible, highly regressive regulatory tax, so to speak, and on top of the $3 trillion that you paid on your taxes, it's still not enough, because we're now nearly $29 trillion in debt. It's sad, it's insulting, it's discouraging. I mentioned inflation a minute ago, and I want to get back to that for a moment. It is the natural, foreseeable consequence of a government that really knows no limits on what it's there to do, and knows essentially no limits on what it can spend. These days, if the federal government can dream it, if politicians can desire it, they can fund it. There's never been an institution on planet Earth who had access to more capital than the federal government does. There's never been a government in the existence of planet Earth that has had the ability to produce the amount of wealth that this nation has, and the ability of its people to produce that wealth, and the ability of the government to spend that amount of money. Because of that, this government also has tremendous bargaining power, and it has correspondingly tremendous borrowing power that goes along with that. In other words, because the American economy has been strong, and because the U.S. dollar has been the world's reserve currency of choice, that's given us this ability. It might make it seem like money, while not growing on trees technically, can be sort of printed into existence, just taken out of thin air, and that we won't feel the consequence for it. Now, you can get away with that a little bit longer when you have the world's reserve currency and an economy as large as ours, with credit that has been relatively good compared to that of other sovereign nations. But it does have limits, and we're seeing those limits now, Mr. President. We're seeing them in ways we haven't seen it. Yes, I was worried about this, scared to death of it 10, 11 years ago when I first got here. But it's so much worse now. It's so much worse now because we have behaved in a way that has made it worse. You can't hide it for that long. The piper eventually has to be paid, and the consequences eventually make themselves known. And it's finally starting to harm American families by reducing their real earnings and undercutting their purchasing power. In new research that we just released this week, the Joint Economic Committee Republicans, and I'm the ranking Republican on that committee, found that these rising prices are brought about as a result of a mix of two types of inflation: transitory inflation and more lasting inflation brought about by runaway government spending. We found that government stimulus measures have ignited more lasting, more systemic inflation. These inflationary pressures are building on transitory inflation, and they're pushing prices higher. That's why I'm really concerned that over a year after the recession officially ended, Congress continues undaunted, unhindered, and seemingly more eager than ever in its desire to pursue new, massive government spending measures, including a $3.5 trillion budget resolution, the single largest spending package in history. If Congress continues to pursue spending packages that boost consumer demand, while at the same time depressing employment and investment, which is exactly what we're doing, then government-induced inflation will increase even further with even more drastic, painful consequences for us all, but especially for America's poor and middle class. The wealthy and well-connected will do just fine. The wealthiest among us will probably get rich as a result. The politicians among us who vote for these things will probably be patted on the back, congratulated by a compliant, dutiful news media, and most importantly, congratulated by each other, while poor and middle-class Americans will be left silently carrying the bill, bearing the pain of what they're doing to them. Congress should consider the inflationary risks of this pattern of unfettered, unrestrained government spending. My colleagues should be aware that the costs go beyond the simple sticker price of new spending. The American people would be better served by policies that are geared toward returning Americans to work and removing barriers to business investment in American workers. But we're not doing that. We're going in the opposite direction of where we should. And as a result, Americans are paying the price, especially poor and middle-class Americans. It's certainly affecting people in my home state of Utah. 85% of Utahns who were polled recently said that they're concerned about inflation. And they have reason to be. We've got data from all over the country. Look, nationwide, overall prices are up 5.3% over last year, just in 1 year alone. 5.3% overall nationwide. Some areas of the economy, it's particularly acute. You see it in meat prices, which are up 8% overall from last year. Beef is an astounding 12% more expensive than last year. Milk, 10% more expensive. Gasoline costs 50% more than it did a year ago. In the Salt Lake City area, home prices are up 26% above where they were last year. So everything from gas to groceries, from housing to health care, are all going up in like fashion. And global supply chains, quite frankly, can't keep up. Warnings are already being raised about holiday shortages and huge price increases, as there just aren't enough goods in the entire economy to meet demand. Because again, you just add more money to it. It doesn't make it more affordable, it makes it less affordable. Flooding more spending and therefore more money chasing fewer goods will only cause prices to rise even more. That hurts the poorest Americans the most. The federal government prioritizes those who are already wealthy and well-connected with its spending. And as politicians right here in this chamber congratulate themselves and each other and are congratulated by a compliant mainstream news media that for whatever reason always wants to praise the expansion of the federal government, even when it hurts America's poor and middle class, which it does. Americans are paying the price. Poor and middle class Americans are paying the price. Those least able to do anything about it. And yes, we are causing that. So as we prioritize helping the wealthy and well-connected with this kind of spending, those Americans who don't have paid lobbyists are left in the dust, holding the bags, harmed the most. We aren't cold or calloused for rejecting more spending. No, no. We're considering those who end up paying the price for this monopoly money ploy to spend without end. The everyday Americans, the hardworking Americans, shouldn't be harmed like this, and yet they are going to be. They are already feeling that. It's indefensible. So we're nearing a point of having nearly $29 trillion in our national debt. It's the highest debt in our nation's history, and the debt to GDP ratio is now over 125%. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, debt to GDP ratio, where economic growth around the world throughout human history, growth tends to stall out once we cross that 100% debt to GDP ratio. Just a couple of years ago, we were still, I don't know, in the 80% range. And now we're at about 125%. Politicians have promised to deal with the national debt for decades. They've promised it over and over and over again. And now the argument has shifted. Some on the other side of the aisle are saying that debt doesn't matter, or that it might even be good. In fact, they're saying that it's so necessary that if we don't add to it, if we don't augment it, if we don't feed this beast, then we're somehow going to cause economic catastrophe. Now look, it may be good for their socialist makeover of America. It is disastrous for the people back home, especially those who they claim will be benefiting from it. The debt has reached absolutely unimaginable levels. It's almost $230,000 per taxpayer, nearing $87,000 per citizen. Meanwhile, businesses across the country are struggling to keep their doors open. Among labor shortages, skyrocketing prices, heavy regulation, vaccine and other mandates, and people losing their jobs because the President of the United States, using authority he doesn't have, through an order he is unwilling to even share with us. They're having to choose in some cases between getting a vaccine that in some cases might be hazardous to their health based on unique circumstances and the judgment of their own doctor, and yet they have to choose between getting the vaccine and losing their job. Many businesses are barely inching along. So no, Mr. President, they don't need more government spending. In fact, talking to countless business owners in Utah, more spending is the last thing they need. But it's certainly the last thing that poor middle-class Americans need. What happens when we do that is they all get poorer, even as we're congratulated and we congratulate each other for expanding government yet again. I've had recent conversations with a number of business owners who, because of the heavy hand and the heavy spending practices of government, have been unable to keep themselves even in business. Spoke to one of many restaurant owners recently who explained his inability, even after increasing repeatedly the offering price, offering huge signing bonuses, and 15, then 16, then 18, then 19, then $20 an hour on top of that hiring bonus, just to hire people to work at his restaurant in a college town with a lot of young people who are usually willing to work in restaurants. They couldn't do it because of government interference. Government was competing with them. Government was paying people more to not work than they could be paid to work. This is only compounding the problem. None of this would be possible, Mr. President, if we weren't effectively operating this government with the printing press that makes the American people poorer. So yeah, I signed that letter 2 months ago, along with 46 Republican senators, almost the entire Senate Republican Conference. I signed that not just because the letter looked neat, not because it would get praise. I knew it would get the opposite of that in the press, but because of the people we represent, especially the poor and middle class we represent, who will be made poorer and less secure every single time we do this. I can't vote to raise this debt ceiling, not right now, especially given the plans at play to increase spending immediately by another $3.5 trillion, which according to some is only as low as $3.5 trillion because of a creative accounting that the real number might be more like $5 trillion. Regardless, we can't do that. We can't afford that. It's not that the government can't physically do it. We know its ability to do it. But we also know that when it exercises that ability to do that, poor and middle-class Americans suffer. I can't do this to them. Neither should any of us. Thank you, Mr. President.